Shigeko Ito is an author, educator, and mental health advocate. She has a PhD in education from Stanford University. The Pond Beyond the Forest is her memoir of a middle-aged Japanese immigrant mother's struggle to raise her teenage son and save her marriage when she finds herself triggered by memories of her own childhood trauma as he enters adolescence. Shigeko never gave up on trying to improve the family dynamic. She never stopped trying to heal herself and her relationships with her husband and her son. Her story is relatable for many and on many levels, including those who may feel overwhelmed by unresolved trauma. You do not want to miss her story.
Have you ever felt like giving up, quitting, throwing in the towel? Welcome to Never Ever Give Up Hope featuring Carol Graham. She's an author, health coach, and motivational speaker. Backed into a corner multiple times in her life, Carol shares with you stories on how she overcame some of the toughest obstacles a person can go through in life, but refused to give up hope. Rather than admit defeat, an opportunity was presented, and it involves each and every one of you. Carol will feature spectacular guests who will share their messages of hope, encouragement, and their inspiration to prove why life's adversities only make you stronger. And now, welcoming the host of the show, here's Carol Graham.
Welcome, Shigeko.
Thank you. Yeah, so glad to be here.
And that is a very interesting name. You are from where?
Japan.
Japan.
Mm-hmm.
And how long have you been on this side of the world?
Oh, let's see. So 44, almost
Oh my
45.
goodness. Oh my
Yeah.
goodness. Okay. But you still have family and everything there?
Yeah, I have my father passed away, but my mother's still there. She's 94. And then I have two brothers. They're all in Japan, so I'm here by myself.
Oh, really? Okay. But you do have your immediate family here, which we're going to talk about
Yes.
today, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Uh-huh.
Now, your journey as an immigrant mother and survivor of childhood emotional neglect has shaped your passion for supporting others. I love that. And their healing journeys. You developed a desire to break the silence around undeniable link between childhood trauma and adult mental health challenges. Now, I have heard this from many different interviews, and it's
Uh-huh.
always so interesting because everybody has a different approach, and I'm looking
Mm-hmm.
forward to hearing yours because you have lived it. You've lived the trauma, and then you lived the success of getting through that. So this is what we're
Yeah.
going to start with your story today. Tell us your story.
Okay, so I grew up in Japan in a family, in a wealthy family, but emotionally very distant and disconnected. And my father was a surgeon, and he founded his own hospital. And my mother, who was about 10 years younger, she was a socialite who did, I mean, I'm the youngest of the three, so
Mhm.
I don't know about how she was with the other brothers. But by the time I was born, she just didn't want to be staying at home. So luckily, my father owned this hospital with so many employees that there are no shortage of people who pitch in to take care of me. So she was able to do whatever she wanted to. And I just didn't, my father, I know, was very loving and he loved me, but he was a workaholic. So I didn't get to see him much at all. So basically, I had this revolving cast of caregivers who are very loving and kind and attentive, but they were always changing. So it kind of created this very unstable environment as a little child. So I kind of grew up with a fear of abandonment. And, basically what I've been learning is that, something like emotional neglect is very invisible. And compared to like, something more obvious, like physical abuse or sexual abuse during the childhood. And because, I was outwardly very wealthy, and my parents were, recognized in the community, I was not allowed to complain about how sad I was or lonely or whatever. So, and then, if you grew up in that setting, you just kind of normalize that. I think most families, especially back in when I was growing up, they were known for more close knit family,
Oh,
especially like
okay. Okay.
yeah, well, the mothers tends to be very much, almost to the point of enmeshment with children, but
Okay. Good.
they're very involved. And I had very unusual circumstances. My mother was absent, and then I had to go to a very competitive elementary school in Tokyo, having to commute for about an hour and a half each way in a rush hour train. And so that went on till like sixth grade because we all had to take a entrance exam to get into a middle school.
What do you mean by
But
a
because,
competitive in those first years? A
well, it's
competitive
very
school.
academic in a
Okay.
way that we have so much homework, and little kids went to supplemental cram school after school. And because it was so competitive in a way that to get into a prestigious
Okay.
middle school, they have to prepare early on.
Hmm.
And but because I was always in a survival mode, that went on for at least first 12 years of life, I was just not prepared to be in that competitive environment. So I was always catching up, and I was exhausted from the commute. And so I could not turn off this survival mode. I felt tremendous insecurity and sense of inferiority.
Did you have
And
anybody to talk to or
well, the thing is, well, those caregivers, were around, but in terms of friends, I went to a school so far away that I didn't have friends in a neighborhood. So I had to kind of calm my ripped up nervous system by being in a pond. There's a chapter in my book called Japanese Garden, and that's where I found solace and comfort, kind of recharge
Mhm.
myself. But pretty much, and then my brothers were much older than I am. One is 9 years older, the other one is 5 years. And I don't know where they were, but they were not around either. So, and I had a housekeeper who was there until 5:30 or something but after she had left, sometimes I was left alone. I mean, those caregivers were around when I was really young, but starting in grade school, I had to feel the time alone with my dogs, um, and then I had to tackle very daunting amount of homework. So there's just no time for me to relax, always sort of be on the edge kind of thing. I mean, this is not in my book, but after I completed my manuscript, over the last 5 years or so, I started to hear about this thing called complex trauma, complex PTSD, attachment trauma, developmental trauma, relation trauma. And those stem from like a prolonged toxic stress in early childhood. I mean, it can happen later, but if the toxic stress gets prolonged for a long time, then the child's, and during the time that the child's brain is developing very rapidly and susceptible, they get stuck in the survival mode and they cannot turn it off, because this part of the brain that senses the danger, lack of safety or unpredictability of the environment,
And
it's super activated.
how common is that?
So, we're kind of wired for survival, right? So if there are sense of danger, that part of the fight or flight mode of the brain, it gets activated. And then it kind of interfere with the other parts of the brain development, like hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, which is more like executive functioning of the higher brain functioning. When children are threatened, like their sense of safety is threatened, it just disrupt that normal, healthy brain development.
Right, I get it.
And then they kind of so basically we get stuck in that thing. And usually when children have a steady attuned caregiver to help them manage stress, they can learn how to manage that. But if there's no such caregiver, then they're often left to improvise, to survive difficult situations full of stress. They develop this coping mechanism, like checking out, numbing,
Right.
emotional distancing, and all the other stuff. And then they stay through adulthood. And because those type of coping strategies get so embedded in our life that we tend to mistake them as like a personality flaw.
So is that how it comes out later in life then? And
Yes.
maybe give an example of that.
So I thought that environment was the way it was, and I was just kind of struggling all the things. It was just because I was just never good enough or something. And then I struggle pretty much, like, I never really liked school. And when I started middle school, we had to take English, and I was the kind of the bottom students in English class. And so I started attending language school, and that was fun, actually. And when I was 16, the language school put together a homestay program. So I participated in the program, and then that's where I met this most wonderful American host family in California. And they basically threw me a lifeline. And then I experienced what it's like to be in a very loving.
How old were you then?
I was 16.
Oh, okay.
And I didn't want to go home back in Japan, but I had to. So I did. But that's when my kind of existential crisis type of thing started, after I went back to Japan and saw this disparity between these two families, pushed me into some kind of soul searching journey. And so, but about a year after that, I became more combative and volatile, and especially towards my mother. And, my parents started to really worry, because I used to be very quiet and obedient and never complain anything. And then, there's a period that I just got so immersed into learning about the meaning of life, and why things are happening the way it was. And so I spent maybe several days or a week just reading the Bible and philosophy books and Zen Buddhism and all the things, just to get this. I wanted the answer for the big question, and I was 17 or something. But because I got so engrossed in the moment that I didn't even know that I wasn't sleeping or eating. And I think that went on for about, I don't know, a week or so. And then all of a sudden I had this kind of euphoric feeling, like, oh, okay, well, all I have to do is just follow the divine or the God, and I'll be protected. And so I became so happy after this volatile, and that just totally freaked out my family. And one time my brother, who's also a doctor, he came with a syringe and he said, well, you haven't been sleeping and you need to relax and this will help you. So I said, no, I don't want that. I'm fine. I'm fine, totally. Just leave me alone. But he gave me a shot anyway, and then turned out to be a tranquilizer. And then several days later, I woke up in a strange hospital room. It turned out to be a mental hospital, and I was 17 then, and because I was exhibiting this kind of manic behaviors and even auditory hallucination, so they just treated me like I was a schizophrenia, and they bombarded me with antipsychotics. So that was very difficult experience. But the upside of that is that a lot of doctors, they investigated my home environment, and they told me that it was really the dysfunction of the family that I developed what I developed. So basically, they were validating me in a way that, basically it was a somewhat normal reaction to the abnormal circumstance kind of thing.
How did that make you feel? Yeah, to realize that.
Well, I felt seen. I felt seen and understood pretty much for the first time, right? But I still didn't know how to connect all the dots. So, and then my mother was totally in denial. She basically said I just developed this the illness of a spoiled, ungrateful child, or something like that. She never totally took responsibility because I'm not going to go into details, but it's in my book. So so anyway, I wanted to be with this American family, and I just felt like it was like a family betrayal, in a way that I felt so totally alone, never understood by my family, and I wanted to be with American family. So it took me a while to get back, or like the brain, my brain was just so messed up from this medication that I was really worried whether or not I can be normal. But it took me several years, but I somehow managed to get back on my feet. And so I came to the States alone when I was 22. And then in a healthier environment, I thrived, right? So I just thought what happened during this teenager years was a kind of fluke. So I never thought about it. And so the kind of thing that I was susceptible to, like anxiety and depression and all that stuff, that I thought I was cured. But when I became a mother, then those things came back again. And then all those unresolved trauma resurfaced. And because I was just so devoted to my son, because I wanted to protect him and not to, put him in a similar situation that I was in. So because I knew there's something was about my childhood that kind of led me to that, right? But I just didn't have a blueprint of how to care for him. So I went over to the other extreme, that I just poured everything towards him, everything, and then I just got burned out, And then because of this kind of survival strategy that I developed as a child, like perfectionism or nothing, black and white thinking, formula for burnout. And I was so accustomed not to take care of myself. So, my needs were always at the bottom of the priority. And that really took a toll on me and my marriage as well. My son was fine, but I think he really sensed that, my burnout and and I didn't even recognize that I was developing postpartum depression because I was just so focused on him. So it was a delayed understanding of what was happening to me. So I started to journal to cope with the stress. And basically, my harsh inner critic was growing so much that it itself was causing anxiety and depression. And I was just always, I had this punitive voice inside me, and like, oh, you're never good enough, and you're not a good mother, and all those things. So I started to journal, and I think journaling really kind of helped to and understand what was going on. Um, and then I guess when my son was about 10, I participated in a writing retreat in British Columbia, and it's called Free Fall Writing. And I'm not going to explain about this method because it's kind of complicated. But for the first time, I wrote about my childhood because every time I tried to write my
Really?
motherhood, yeah. So I every time I tried to write about my motherhood experience, I just broke down and cried because it was just so raw, and but I
Hmm.
started writing about my childhood. And then when the instructor shared that piece with the group, which was about 8 people, I saw people kind of crying, like one of them like reach out to a Kleenex and and then they gave me such a supportive, loving feedback.
Hmm.
And that was the first time I really felt after the hospitalization and doctor told me, whatever
Right.
I experienced was not normal and my family was not normal. Um, I felt seen and heard and understood for the second time, I guess. This was just such a big breakthrough for me. And that's when I discovered the healing power of storytelling, to share my story and to be heard and understood. And also for them, it was such a, I almost felt like being mothered in
Hmm.
the by the loving energy. And so that's kind of got me hooked on this storytelling path.
Okay,
And
that I appreciate you sharing your story and the progress. I I made a lot of notes here and I see there'd be a lot of people that would relate because of how you went through this, how you went through the whole process, right?
mm-hmm.
And I think that's what you are going to share now when we talk about things like intergenerational trauma and some of the
Yes.
and how people can learn from what you experience. And so we're going to take a
Mm-hmm.
quick break and we'll be back in a
Okay.
couple minutes and then
Okay.
we will continue.
Carol Graham would like to show you the path from misery to miraculous triumph in her fast-paced memoir, Battered Hope. She relates her determination to succeed as someone who experienced one horrendous nightmare after another: gang raped and left for dead, loss of a child, husband falsely imprisoned, and cancer. Nothing could break her tenacity or faith. No matter what you face, heartache, loss, suffering, or injustice, Carol will illustrate how she became a victor the same way you can. The secret is to never, ever give up hope. Order your copy at Amazon or batteredhope.blogspot.com.
Thank you so much for sharing that part of your story. And now we want to bring it down to how people not only relate to your story, as I'm sure many are, but what they can do when they are in similar or even not so similar situations, but need help to break the chains of intergenerational trauma and to live life to its fullest. I think that's your goal, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
So let's
And
wait, first of all, explain that. Explain the intergenerational trauma that is obviously quite common and what
mhm.
impact it makes on children and right into adulthood.
I didn't really find out about this until much later, but my mother lost her mother when she was really young. She couldn't even remember, maybe 1 or 3. She doesn't even remember what her mother looked like. And then she was sent. to live with the relatives for a while until her father got remarried. And so she never really experienced the real mother-daughter kind of relationship herself. And then
Okay.
my father, he also had a kind of a difficult experience that his parents divorced when he was in grade school. They never really told me anything about this, and I had to kind of did a lot of sleuthing to understand them because they never want to talk about their past. I think my father was very grateful towards his father for putting him through medical school, and but they never really seemed very close. So here, both parents kind of grew up in a sort of not such a happy, you know, loving family circumstance. So they really didn't know how to make family. And for me to be able to understand that, I was able to be more forgiving because they just didn't know any better. But what they were not disclosing is like they never want to talk about feelings. There's just in the whole family, it was like family of 5 just happened to be sharing the same house. But we really had nothing to do with each other. I'm just talking in a very general term. And we didn't really have much dinner together, right? And there's no checking on each other. So basically, I have to be on my own. So something like emotional neglect, it's so invisible that until we started to go through some kind of stressful circumstance and kind of maladaptive coping strategies, start to wreak havoc in relationships. And that's when I start to look closely, make sense of my life
Right.
and what was happening. So something like emotional is just so invisible, and we tend to normalize it because it's very hard to articulate, and we tend to dismiss or misunderstood.
Mm-hmm.
But the science now shows it could be just as detrimental and create powerful impact on the child's developing brain and nervous system. It shows up in a very similar kind of a coping mechanism. So if you start to pay attention to the coping mechanism, start to see some deeper layer. Like for me, it was negative self-perception, a lack of confidence, insecurity, harsh inner critic. And even no matter what I achieved, I was never good enough. And it was kind of puzzling to me. Like, where did this come from? Is it just really personality flaws or something? But that was a kind of telltale sign of the complex trauma. And so, but it's just so easy to overlook. And therefore, it's easy to pass on to the next generation. And I wanted to stop this transmission to my son. But, I was not perfect. So it's not like he came out unscathed completely, but I did a lot of heavy lifting. And for him to, we went through a family counseling together, and he came to understand my own pain. And, he's a very empathic person. So he really developed more of an understanding. I think it was very important to voice that and to not to repress it, because that's how everything gets sort of pushed down, and then it may stay dormant when things are going well, but when kind of crisis or stressful situation, it just because the unresolved trauma hasn't been processed, right? So it just resurfaced. And in a way, it manifests in a very childish way, like, lashing out and just checking out or just distancing, and it just creates more problems.
Yeah, is this what you have? Is it your story that you have written in your book, or?
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah,
so tell us a little bit
so,
about your book.
yeah, so it it has kind of sort of two storyline, and one is like my current life as a mother and a wife of raising a teenage son, and then another storyline is about my upbringing, and it kind of goes back and forth, to kind of provide some kind of explanation of what's manifesting now with my past. So there's a hospitalization, like my childhood experience, and also hospitalization experience woven into this storyline.
So who should buy your book?
Who should buy? It's written in a very accessible narrative, so it's written for the general public. But what I'm finding out these days is that there are a lot of academic libraries acquiring this, and I think they see some deeper layer because I have a research background. So basically, and I'm sort of like very analytical person to begin with. So when I was telling a story, it's basically lived experience, and I was sort of providing like a meaning making layer, like interpretation. Maybe this is the way I was said it because of this, or I was behaving this way because of what happened, way back when. So it's for the mothers. I dedicated to the all moms with unhealed childhood trauma. And it's probably for women going through some struggles with marriage, like a midlife kind of crisis, or struggling with raising teenagers, and also menopause. that could be part of the puzzle, the things that I cover. The period of my son's high schools, when is one of the storyline, was this emotional volatility that I was going through. I partly blame my menopause because that could wreak a havoc on how we become overreactive to things. But I realize it also has a lot to do with my unresolved trauma. Yeah, so mothers, anybody, it doesn't have to be, it could be anybody who is caring for children and with unmetabolized or unresolved trauma, and how that is becoming such a challenge. And I just wanted to help raise awareness about this because it's just not talked about much. And, but once we realize what's happening, then, well, at least in my experience, I develop much deeper self understanding and accepting myself. And I start to grow more caring, nurturing maternal voice to sort of counteract this harsh inner critic. And because there's this short circuit, like I kind of screw things up, and then therefore I am failure, or I'm never good enough or something. I kind of interrupt that short circuit and then sort of observe, creating space between my experience and the reaction, and then observe without judgment. You kind of slows down that circuit over time. And then if you keep practicing that, then you can grow that new wire more strongly. So for me, that led to practicing self-compassion, understanding, and acceptance. And that was a huge sea change for me.
So who should buy your book?
Well, I dedicated my book to all moms with unresolved or unhealed childhood trauma. So it is. It doesn't have to be mother; it could be fathers too, who carry unresolved childhood trauma, and how that is affecting their parenting, and also people who are kind of struggling with their life, and like something that happened in childhood and wanted to make sense of their lives, and
Okay.
kind of, yeah.
Now, is there anything in particular that you would like to share with the audience in conclusion? I know you covered quite a lot of area today, and I appreciate
Mm-hmm.
that. But is there any message, possibly, whether it's from your book or just in general, that you would like to leave with the audience in conclusion?
So this is something I sensed intuitively, but now there's this research that shows how prolonged toxic stress in childhood can change the brain and nervous system. And we develop
Oh, really?
sort of a childhood, the survival adaptations that become later in life maladaptive and interfere with developing healthy relationships with others, especially the closest ones, like children or
Okay.
husband,
Okay.
spouse.
Right.
That it's not their fault, and just to kind of unshackle them from this self-blame tendency and stop beating themselves up and develop more self-understanding towards what happened. So instead of, what's wrong with me, say what happened to me and how that is impacting me in the current life. And, my book has a happy ending. So I hope it will give them hopes that the healing is possible at any age, to just develop more self-compassion for ourselves, because with the childhood trauma, we tend to become too self-negating and kind of put ourselves at the bottom priority, but we're just as important and need to attend to our needs. And if we tend to operate from the depleted cup, it will take a toll over time. But if we kind of learn to balance our needs and others' needs, and also be kind to ourselves, we can have much more fulfilling life and develop healthier relationship with people who are important.
Very well stated. I appreciate
Oh, thank
that.
you.
And I'm sure that there are going to be a lot of people who not only relate to your story, but also what you just said in conclusion. So I thank you so much. This has been a wonderful interview. I thank you for what you shared. I thank you for being so raw in sharing your story from what you went through as a child as well, and how you have turned that around and can be an inspiration to other people. So thank you so much for being on Never Ever Give Up Hope.
Thank you for listening to Never Ever Give Up Hope, featuring Carol Graham. Did you know that most people succeed because they are determined to? Quitting was never an option. Carol loves your comments and will respond to each one. So please subscribe and review this podcast. A rating of 5 stars would be outstanding and appreciated. Remember, if you are still here, there is always hope.